you, Tom, for that introduction, and I'm really grateful to the AFA for inviting me. This is, I've done the time. So it's not picking up. Okay, let's see. I don't want to ruin this time. How's that? Is that better? Yeah. Okay. This is not so tight. Anyway, so this is the second time I've spoken at the AFA convention. I'm very grateful for the invite, but it's certainly not the second time I've been to an AFA convention. I went to Albuquerque in the late 80s. It was the first time I attended this event. And I was here in Reno, again, I think right at the end of the 80s. And so I've probably been to about 8 AFA conventions. And you finally got round to inviting me to speak. I don't know what it is I said in the 90s, but I'm sorry, whatever I said. But anyway, we're obviously back on good terms. So I've been asked to give 2 presentations this afternoon and tomorrow, and I hope they fit together as one story. I tried to avoid all the lectures I gave in Cincinnati last year and on the West Coast and come up with something new. But in some ways it is a continuation of my PhD studies. It's just thinking about how this impacts on shoeing and trimming in general and the horse in general. So I will show you just a little bit of what I found in those studies, just so that you understand where I'm coming from. But the whole point of this presentation is to think about hoof shape. So there isn't shoeing in this part, in this presentation, and there isn't really trimming as such. Tomorrow, we're going to try and look at the effects that a Farrier can have on hoof shape. And of course, sometimes that's beneficial and sometimes it's detrimental. So I have a longish line of list of topics because there are a lot of things that affect the hoof shape of horses. Early development of a foal's hoof is, of course, part of my PhD, so we're going to look at that. And we are going to look quickly at the anatomy before all this. I'm going to look at acquired deformities. In other words, those are the deformities that a horse is not born with, but gets quite early on in its life. And those definitely affect the hoof shape, so we're going to look at a couple of those. Breed, I don't think I need to tell you, because I'm sure most of you do a variety of breeds, that there are breed characteristics in the shape of our horse's hooves. So I'm just going to compare 2 breeds in this presentation and hopefully 2 extremes of shape. Conformation, in other words, the shape of the leg, definitely affects hoof shape over a period of time. The debate will be, of course, is there anything we can do about that, or should we accept that the horse's conformation is relatively set once it passes about 18 months? And are we then just managing the shape, or can we still bring about change? Laterality has been thought about a little bit more in the last few years. I certainly wrote a paper which was published in the American Farrier Journal, and I think that was only the 2nd paper on laterality. A guy called Ernie Gray, and I don't know if anybody here remembers him, was well ahead of his time. He wrote about laterality in 1989. As I say, I think I wrote the next article probably only 10 years ago. So it's a subject all on its own, but we're going to look at that later on and think about whether laterality affects hoof shape. Loading was a big part of my doctorate degree, and looking at how the horse bears weight. The previous lecture, the lecture of Doug Russo, I was listening to how he was saying, quite interestingly, that a horse can adjust to loading front to back, but because of the nature of the joints, cannot from side to side. And I thought that was an interesting way of looking at it. So loading is not quite the same as weight bearing. When I stand here, I have a certain weight. a little bit more than it used to be, but I have a weight, and that weight is passed through both my legs. The difference is that loading is how much weight is carried by my left leg and how much by my right leg. And then we can subdivide that down to areas. So loading is actually specific weight bearing in areas, and from our point of view, in areas of the hoop. So we're going to look at that. The environment, and I've already heard one discussion from this podium yesterday on environmental effects upon hoof shape. So we're just going to briefly look at that and try and think about that. And of course wear, it's easy to forget that horses wear their feet into different shapes. They wear their hooves differently, and that produces a differing hoof shape, and that can be sometimes detrimental because the horse has some condition that is causing it to wear its feet in an uneven manner. So we mustn't forget that just that simple thing of hoof wear actually affects the shape of our horse's hooves. An injury, of course, and one of the reasons that injury affects hoof shape is that it alters loading. And again, that was already discussed this morning. So injury can have an effect, and there can be direct injury to the hoof capsule or injury to a leg that changes the way the horse loads that hoof. I have to tell you that there is a difference in English and American English on the term hoof and foot. So in England, and when I say the hoof, I actually only mean the horny capsule. And I know here in the States that it often is used synonymously for the foot. We say that the horse's foot is the hoof and all that's contained within it. So that's a slight difference. So when I'm saying hoof, I only mean that horny capsule. I do not mean the insides. If I mean the whole lot, I'm going to say foot. I don't know if you know, Winston Churchill said a lot of interesting things, but he did say that Britain and America were two countries divided by a common language. But you know, I actually grew up with Americans, so I can often translate for people. So if you have any problems, I try and remember to say aluminum and rather than the correct word, aluminium, but you know. Okay, disease causes change. And there are various diseases. I'm probably only going to look at about one. We've just heard a lecture on canker, and any horse that has canker in a period, the hoof shape will change, and that's probably down to loading, but there are other reasons and other diseases which cause a change in hoof shape. And again, we mustn't forget that Farriery, when we trim a foot, we change the shape of the hoof. So there's a long list of topics there, and I hope I'm going to get through them in a little bit more detail, but that's all I'm really going to think about. But first we're going to look at anatomy, just to remind ourselves about the equine foot and the hoof capsule surrounding it. So here you can see a hoof, and it's a young foal, and it's a sagittal section, but it's been laid obliquely, so you can see all the types of horn on that hoof capsule. So we can see the frog, and the bars here, and the hoof wall running around here, and the sole. Here we can see, because it's cut as a sagittal section, we can see a section through the hoof wall. So that's already shown us the three major types of hoof horn. And of course we have the white line, that elasticated horn, which unites the sole and the hoof wall and allows them to both move in different directions during locomotion and probably during just loading. Here we can see that the stratum medium, which is the main bulk of the hoof wall, can be subdivided into the unpigmented, which is also known as the zona alba, and the pigmented hoof. So there's a subdivision there, and also there is a difference across that hoof wall, and we're going to look at that. The final fairly minor horn is the periople, also known as the stratum externum, and that of course covers the joint between the hoof and the skin, and that's a fairly obvious need to do that to stop foreign bodies getting in there. So those are the 5 types of horn. I would have to say, almost exclusively, the only one of interest to me from the point of view of this lecture is the hoof wall. It's the largest part of the hoof capsule, and it is the one that's subject to change the most. I know we also have shape change with the sole, but the main one that we recognise, hoof shape change, is by the hoof wall. So just to remind ourselves as well that much as even as farriers we often look at the hoof and it seems a very solid object, we need to remind ourselves occasionally that it's quite small in comparison with the rest of the horse, and of course it is actually quite narrow. It's in regard and in proportion to the horse, it's actually a very narrow, flexible organ. I quite like this diagram because it also reminds us that the horse is suspended within the hoof capsule. And that has ramifications for the way the hoof acts and the way the hoof can be deformed. And we can see from this diagram, this slice taken out of the hoof capsule, represented here. This is the distal phalanx, the bone. So the lamellae here, the primary lamellae, which is 500 to 600, and then secondary lamellae stretching off those, and of course they suspend the weight of the horse, which in itself is a remarkable thing, because they don't just suspend the weight. When the horse gallops or when it jumps a fence, you think of the force coming down with the weight of the body weight behind it, pushing down into the hoof capsule. So they do an extraordinary job. We know that the only time they really fail in cases of laminitis. It is said that this system of lamellae, because they increase the surface area, they increase it to about 2.4 meters squared. And I can usually translate actually from meters into inches, but I can't quite do that. It's sort of probably about 3 square yards. From a hoof that's obviously often only about 4 inches by 12 inches. So it really expands the surface area, and it's in that manner that the horse does not push its pedal bones through the bottom of its hoof, provided they are healthy. We are going to look at the structure of the hoof wall because it is quite interesting in that lots of people talk about it being a tubular structure, which it is, but it's far more complex than that. So we're going to look at that in the next couple of slides. And we're also going to look at how hoof grows, because it's important to have some understanding of hoof growth if we're going to understand how hoof distorts. So this is one of the first slides I made in my PhD, and it's a very young foal. In fact, I think this one is a foal about a month before birth. And you can see how small it is because 1,000 microns is 1 millimetre. And so this is only 3 or 4 millimetres across, which I'm not sure if I can translate that, but that's somewhere between 1/10 and 2/10 of an inch. So it's a young foal. And that's why proportionately these lamellae look way out of, well, very long. So we know that the hoof wall is entirely generated, well, in a healthy horse from the germinative layer at the top here, the papillae, and in between the papillae, just the flat germinative layer. And the papillae, of course, produce these horn tubules, and in between is the intertubular horn. Now, I don't know what's taught in the States, but our apprentices are taught in Hickman's that the hoof wall is made up of horn tubules glued together with intertubular horn. That couldn't be further from the truth. And I'm probably the only person in this room that knew old Colonel Hickman, who was a wonderful chap. And I can't work out whether he thought that we weren't clever enough to take the truth, or he didn't know himself. But I'm going to try and explain to you why it is not horn tubules glued together. That's definitely not what is going on in the hoof wall. So this is a diagrammatic version, or representation, I should say, of the germinative layer, where the keratinocytes or horn cells are produced. And so you can see this representation of the papillae here and here. That's why they have the P. This is the basal layer, which has mother cells, which are continually producing keratinocytes, otherwise horn cells. So papillae, you could almost show it. For example, if you had a piece of rubber and you stuck your fingers into that rubber, thin rubber membrane, they would stick down through there. And that would change the shape of that surface. So we need to stop thinking of the papillae as if they are separate organs, as if they are different from the rest of the germinative layer. All they are is the same germinative layer being pushed down into these little teat-like projections. But what effect does that have on the generation of horn and the generation of cells? Well, here in between them, and it is about 50-50 of intertubular horn and tubular horn. So in between each one, there's a relatively level area, and horn cells are generated in this direction. But if we think of the papillae, then of course the direction of generation is going to be this way. And even this diagram doesn't tell it exactly, because you've got to remember that this is a two-dimensional representation of something that's three-dimensional. In fact, they're radiating out from those papillae. So they are being produced almost, not quite, but almost at 90 degrees to the direction of the intertubular horn. So we're going to see what effect that has. All right, this is a very simplified representation of a diagram that's in corrected Farriery, and all I've left in it is the only things that matter to us, really. So all the cells, when they're first produced, are the same as the rest of the body. It is only after production that they start to specialise. So those cells could be produced anywhere in the body, but they're produced there at the germinative layer of the hoof wall, so they're quite important. And rapidly they change. They are filled with these keratin tonofilaments, so filaments of keratin, strands of keratin. And it's the keratin that makes up the skeleton of the cell. It basically supports it. And again, this is two-dimensional, but what I'm trying to show here is that they are randomly arranged, but in 3 dimensions. So they'll be laying in all different directions. And quite rapidly after generation, the cell starts to die. It's also been pushed away from the germinative layer by the next one that's been generated. So here it's already dying, and the nucleus you can see is flattening out. But it has produced these desmosomes. Now desmosomes are described by Chris Pollitt as spot welding, and I think as Farriers we can understand that. They are extraordinarily strong bonding. And again, this is two-dimensional diagram. You've got to think that there's a cell behind this one, in front of it, above it, and below it. Everywhere it touches another cell, these desmosomes will grab hold. And they will hold it so rigidly that it's very difficult to split them apart. Extraordinarily strong bonding. The other thing that's going on is that as this starts to flatten out and become squamous, and of course squamous is just a posh word, it almost sounds like it being squashed. So these cells become squamous, they become flattened because they're dying. But the effect of that is that these keratin filaments start to line up. They're lining up at 90 degrees to the angle of germination. Now why should that matter? Well, it means they give a particular strength in one direction. So we go back to this little diagram now. Now I hope you can see what is happening, why it's important. So they are no different, these cells, no different at all. But some of them are coming off this way, and some of them are coming off this way. And as soon as they touch, they join together. And then all together, they move in the direction agreed. So they start to move down the hoof wall. So there's no difference between them. In fact, you're better off thinking about tiles or bricks that are just laid in a different pattern. And we know that gives strength. If you build a brick wall with all your bricks just in the same direction, it won't be as strong as a brick wall that's laid with some of them in this direction and some of them in this direction. So it is their orientation that gives them the difference. So they are not, the intertubular horn is not gluing the horn tubules together. It is just more bricks, more cells, and as soon as they touch, they're joined by those desmosomes, And they gather together and as a horde, they're moving down the hoof wall. So I hope that explains a little bit of how horn is generated. Now, generation and growth are different things. They might sound as if they're the same thing, but generation is the production of these cells. Hoof growth is something we understand. It's how much we snip off or rasp off at the bottom of the foot. We could probably say that hoof growth is also what we might be able to measure halfway down the wall. But hoof growth is different from generation. So I want to make that point early on. And I actually believe this process of generation is even around the coronary gland. So that would immediately contradict a lot of theories about why hooves grow out of shape. But we'll come back to that. All right. So one thing I found in my PhD, and probably the most important finding, is that as this hoof wall, which has been generated here from the hairline, but as it moves as a mass, tubular and intertubular horn,